via YouTube. So please make sure to keep your microphone off and your camera so you're not captured in that recording. Take it away.
Thanks, John. I'll just share my screen here. How's that? Is that working okay?
All coming through.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Again, Adrian McKay is my name. I work in Toowoomba office, Department of Regional Development, Manufacturing and Water. One of the first things I did when I joined the department was that we went for a drive for about 3 days. And the whole time we basically didn't get out of the GAB. And we came across some pretty amazing country, some of it flat, some of it hilly, some of it full of springs. And I guess it captured my imagination fairly early on. So hopefully tonight I'll give you a little bit of insight into the things that I know about and a little bit of background around the basin. So what are we going to talk about? We'll do some background. What is the GAB? Some definitions around features of the GAB and a little bit of myth busting. We always like to do some myth busting. We'll do a history of the GAB management, why we monitor and what this tells us, and the water saving initiatives that have been undertaken since the late 80s. So this is the GAB. I'll just turn my pointer on. As you can see, it's fairly extensive, covers 22% of Australia, extends into New South Wales, South Australia and Northern Territory, covers 70% of Queensland, so it's a reasonable proportion. It is quite amazing when you can drive from Ipswich to Birdsville and you're in the GAB, you haven't got out of it yet and you've still got a little bit to go. And north-south, you can go from Cape York and into Western New South Wales. So we have in all groundwater systems, they have a storage component to them. That's not the amount of water that you can actually get out of them on an annual basis or a regular basis. It's how much water sits in there. And that's been assessed at 69,400 million megalitres. So that sounds like a lot of water. To put it into perspective, for people who would like to know a little bit more about that, that's 36,000 Burdekin dams. It's a series of siltstones, sandstones and mudstones that have been deposited over many millions of years. And it ranges from being at the surface, depending on the aquifer and where you are, to nearly 3,000 metres deep in places. So water temperature ranges from 25 and at Birdsville comes out about 99.9 degrees. Just move on. In Queensland, we manage the GAB under what we call the Gabora Water Plan. So that's the Great Artesian Basin and other regional aquifers water plan. So it does include some aquifers that are not part of the GAB themselves. They may underlie or be adjacent to, such as the Laura Basin, the Galilee Basin. As I say, it manages regional aquifers. Most of these are in the GAB. We're talking about 310 plus spring complexes, 2,000 plus artesian bores, and over 15,000 sub-artesian bores. So there's 16 distinct aquifers, 10 of them are GAB ones, and the three main aquifers that we generally refer to are the Hooray Gubramunda, which is one of the biggest aquifers in the basin, the Hutton Aquifer, and the basal aquifer, or the bottom of the GAB proper, is called the Precipice. There are 6 other regional aquifers that I did talk about before in the plan. I won't talk about those tonight, but just for your knowledge, we're talking about the Corumba, the Laura, the Galilee, and the Bowen basins. So this is a slice through the middle of the basin, and it's mainly through one of the basins that make up the GAB, which is called the Eromanga Basin. So the dotted line is the base of what is assessed as the GAB. So this is this line here, and that's determined by Geoscience Australia, fundamentally. And as I was talking about before, you'll have series of formations, geological formations, which are distinct in many cases from each other. And these are the different colours that you can see as you go up the profile. So we'll get into a little bit more about what those basins are and what they're called. But also you can see that there's other depositional basins that sit below that. So the Bowen Basin, we export a lot of coal from the Bowen Basin. The Galilee Basin is currently under development. Older basins like the Odervale, Cooper, Warburton, Simpson and Perdurka, which is over in the Northern Territory. So this is what we call a stratigraphic profile, and been developed by CSIRO. And just to give you a little bit of a feel about what this all means. So the different colours here signify water bearing, and the blues are more water bearing, and the darker colours are what we would call aquitards, or less water bearing. And so where you have formations that are described here, like the Gryman Creek Formation, which is a sort of a grey colour, which basically means that it has a percentage of sandstones, siltstones and mudstones. So they're not as water bearing as, say, the Cumberella beds here or the Hooray sandstone. As you can see, there's a lot of colour there. So the Hooray Gabramunda that I talked about before, the Cadnowis as well. So they're one of the major aquifer systems in the basin, and probably the aquifer that was initially developed when they started drilling bores back in the late 1800s, as they were the first aquifers that you came to in most cases in the artesian parts of the world. Now, just looking over on the left here, as you can see, we're talking geological age. So this is younger at the top and older at the bottom. So there are a number of aquifers that are part of the GAB, which are generally subartesian. So they tend to be the infill parts of the basin. There isn't the change in the water level or the pressure component to enable them to flow in some cases. So as I talked about before, the Hooray and the Gabramundas are the first major aquifer that we come to. Now, the other component of the GAB is you have these things called aquitards. So they restrict the flow of water vertically through the siltstones and the mudstones, and they also create pressure, because when we come along to, say, the Hutton Sandstone Aquifer and we drill a bore into it, because there is a pressure created there by the elevation of the water level in the aquifer, that allows the water then to come to the surface in some cases, depending on where you are. So I guess I'm just trying to sort of highlight here that without the aquitards, you wouldn't have the same pressure component from the aquifers that you do have, and you wouldn't have this distinct characteristics of each of these aquifer systems. Just to go into a little bit more about background, some definitions and what I call myth busting. So what do we have here? Artesian bores and subartesian bores. So an artesian bore on the left here, as you can see, basically when you drill the hole, the water pressure will come to the surface, and in some cases it'll have a significant pressure which will far beyond what the pressure at the surface is, and that may be between 10 centimetres and 70 metres. So to explain how that actually works, you would need to put this casing here if you had a head of 10 metres, that casing there where the headworks are, you would need to put that another 10 metres higher in the air to stop that water from flowing. So in a lot of cases, that's not able to be done. So what we do is we put headworks on them, and then we run them through pipes, and we use the pressure, the natural pressure of the artesian aquifer to distribute water through pipes. The subartesian bore, and as I talked about earlier, there's a lot more subartesian bores in the basin than there are artesian bores. So this is where you drill a hole into the formation and the water level doesn't rise to the surface. Now, you may be in an elevated area and that might be the reason for that. You may be in a recharge area. So to get water to the surface in a subartesian bore, you need a pump and you need an energy source to do that. So there's solar, diesel, or electricity. Just to put that in a basic schematic, what I was trying to I just explain there is that, for example, if we call this the recharge areas, and so we call that one the Hooray Aquifer, which is the one I was talking about before. If you're at miles, then you drill a bore, well, the water won't come to the surface because you're almost at where the Hooray Aquifer, or the Gubramunda Aquifer, which is the same thing, comes to the surface, and therefore the surface is higher than what the pressure surface is, or potentiometric surface, and therefore it's a subartesian bore. As you move further out into the basin and you get lower in the landscape, the pressure still exists. You've got aquitards that sit over the top of it, and when you drill a hole, a bore down into that, you release that pressure. And as you can see, you get a pressure drop when you pump water. If you get enough bores in an area, you'll get pressure drops that'll overlap with each other, and you get regional declines in aquifers. And I guess that's what happened when they started to develop the basin, and a lot of bores went in the same areas at the same time, and they flowed for a while. However, eventually the pressure surface starts to drop and you're unable to pump any water. So purely for an artesian bores now, when we're talking about, what are we talking about when we have a controlled bore or an uncontrolled bore? Explained a little bit earlier before, the controlled artesian bore, it's the same picture, has headworks on it. So this blue area here is the headworks. The pressure allows the water to run through the piping, and you can distribute that off as you like. If we come to the picture on the right, as you can see, there's no headworks at the bore. So therefore, it is uncontrollable. However, you could try to put headworks on that, and you probably still couldn't control it because it's not constructed in a way that would allow the formations around it to control the pressure. So what happens in that case is the water will come up the outside of the casing. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But as you can see, the way to distribute was you ran it then down a bore drain. So your red arrows are evaporative losses. And you can get considerable evaporative losses over long periods, over long distances of bore drains. The water comes from New Guinea in the GAB. I thought this was pretty amazing when I heard this the first time. So I guess just to explain, we look at the picture on the left here of the GAB. These blue areas here are what we would call the recharge areas. And if you'll notice, then they tend to align with the Great Dividing Range in a lot of places. So they're fairly elevated areas. These lines that you can see flowing out to the west and to the south and to the north up into the Carpentaria Basin, from the Carpentaria Basin up into the Gulf of Carpentaria, they're the actual flow lines or pressure lines for the basin. So predominantly southwest or south in the southern parts, and northwest in the Carpentaria or the northern parts of the basin. So in actual fact, the water's heading towards New Guinea. It's not coming from New Guinea. Just to show you again a little bit more detail what that might look like. Here I've done a schematic here which shows you a line which runs from basically one side of Toowoomba out to past Roma there, and you'll see a consistent pattern with what I'm trying to tell you about. Here's the Great Dividing Range. This is Toowoomba. We're sitting on the edge of the range here. We have another aquifer called basalt sitting on top of the GAB. These are the outcrop areas. This is where water goes into these basins. So that's the Gabramunda Hooray sandstone that I was talking about again previously. So if you look at that sandstone, the water will come in here and it dips and gets quite deep as it moves out into the middle of the basin. And then these actually come up. So the Hutton sandstone, this is the Hutton sandstone, which is much thicker here that we're talking about. And this is the precipice sandstone that I did talk about earlier before. So I'll just show you a little bit. This is the Surat Basin area that we're talking about here. So this is where there's been it's part of the reason why we call them basins is because they do have a basin type shape. They do tend to have an area around the edge, which is sitting up in the air, and they have a bowl type arrangement. Now it happens over a pretty big area, but this area here is what they call the Cumberilla Ridge, and you can see this is basement material, which will be a hard rock or a metamorphic rock, and there's a high there. That's where it's determined that there is a change in the basin, and we've moved from the Surat Basin into the Clarence-Morton Basin. History of the GAB. GAB has a very long history, and it I guess, led to changes in the way water is managed in the state. So, of course, GAB source springs were a source of water for First Nations people for thousands of years. And the springs were also a valuable source of water for early pastoralists. Technology enabled bores to be sunk. And in 1878, the first GAB bore was sunk in New South Wales. In Queensland, well, not recognised at the time, a GAB bore or an artesian bore was sunk at Helidon in 1879. So there used to be a spa area there, which a lot of people would come out on the train and bathe in the spa waters. That was obviously very healthy and good for everybody. But as we probably recognised as the first GAB bore in Queensland was Cunnamulla in 1887. I guess why I put that one in there is because at the time, Helidon wasn't recognised as being part of the GAB, but we do recognise that now. So in 1891, there was concern over falling artesian pressure, which led to an introduction of a bill into Queensland Parliament. The bill was unsuccessful at the time. However, I guess demand for water, there was up to 1,500 bores drilled by 1915 in the basin. So there's a lot more water coming out, and people were starting to see the effects of falling artesian pressure. And that led to the Rights in Water and Water Conservation Act and Utilisation Act being implemented in Queensland. So this was a significant change where riparian right and freehold water rights became water rights vested in the state. And I guess the fact that what could happen on one person's property could lead to a regional decline in water pressure sort of led that drive that the state needed to be involved. So 1926, there was an update of the 1910 Act, and the Act then really only talked about artesian water. So it was recognised then that then you needed to manage sub-artesian water in some places as well, being part of the GAB. So they made a change In 1939, following continued development of the basin, as well as continued falling in water pressures, a report was commissioned into the nature and the structure of the GAB as a result of these declining pressures, which led to the 1954 Artesian Water Supplies in Queensland report. So this was a milestone document for the GAB management in Queensland. Fundamentally, the decision was made then that all new bores and all new water supplies needed to be as efficient and controlled as possible. So allowing for technology at the time. Obviously, there was no polypipe or those types of things. So piping was still a significant cost, but there was the drilling technology was available that we could control precious amount of bore, and then we could control it without water coming up the outside of the casing, as I was talking about before. So in 1989, there was an update of the Act at the time, and it was the commencement of cap and pipe schemes in Queensland. And then in 2002, the Water Act of 2000 was implemented. We changed the concept of artesian and sub-artesian was replaced by underground water. And this recognised that it didn't matter whether the water was artesian or sub-artesian, we were managing the whole of the resource, and underground water recognised that. Then we went to implementations of water plans. So for the GAB, the first generation of water plan was 2006, and the second and current water plan is now 2017. So what do we monitor and what does it tell us? We monitor because we're using this resource. What are we using it for? Stock and domestic, and we count bore drain losses as a part of that. And as you can see here, it's estimated to be about 90,000 megalitres there. Town water supplies. Town water supplies are volumetric, so there's many Western Queenslands. There's about 38, 39 towns that are supplied from the Great Artesian Basin. As you can see, there's 93,000 megalitres of volumetric entitlements there. And then we have a concept of associated water. So this is water that comes out as a consequence of mining or extracting oil and gas. So in Queensland, we use over 300,000 megalitres of water from the GAB annually. So we did a bit of work back in 2017 for the previous second generation plan. And we started to, I guess, map back as best we could what water use was at the time. So if we start just to sort of put some of those dates that I talked about earlier into perspective, if we go back, this is 1900, the start of the graph here. We'll just follow, if you just follow the purple line here, which is the average use, there's a minimum and a maximum that was assessed at the time. We look at 1910, which is when the first Act came in. And by 1915, we're talking about peak flow. So there was a period there of about 15 years where the basin was discharging at its maximum. And that was possibly between 600,000 or 800,000 megalitres of water a year. So the consequence of that was, because we couldn't control this flow, from sort of the late 20s on, you had this period where artesian flow and pressure continued to diminish. And in 1954, I talked about earlier that the 1954 report required that there was control and more efficient use of that water. And while it wasn't cap and piping, it certainly made a difference to, as you can see here, there was a continual drop. Now, some of that would have been related to dropping artesian pressures still, but a lot of it was related to the fact that we were able to control bores, and we were able to construct bores better, and we were also using the water more efficiently. So the real gains were made when we started to actually pipe. And if you recall, I talked about earlier that you lose 80% or 90% of your water in the bore drain. So this is where you start to make your real gains. Now this is for the Eromanga Basin, but there was a similar history for the Carpentaria and the Surat Basin as well. So now today, groundwater use is lower than it was in 1900. If we go to the bottom graph, hopefully you can see that. I guess the significant one here is the dark blue, which shows you the amount of uncontrolled bores in Queensland. And they increased to 1954. Then we started to have the influence of the 1954 report, and the lighter blue bores were the controlled bores that we have. So now we can see that most of them are actually controlled, and we still have a few uncontrolled bores left. The other big part of this equation is the green ones, which are sub-artesian bores. So groundwater protection and saving water, the construction of bores is a very important part of that, as well as obviously using the water efficiently. And what's that led to? So here's another part, a sub-area that we have as part of our Gabora plan called the Eromanga North Array, and this shows you all the monitoring bores and the water levels or the pressures that are in those bores over time. So the GAB monitoring network is probably one of the oldest in the world. It goes back to the late 1800s. In this one, we only have bores from 1950, but we do have in other parts of the world, in other parts of the state, monitoring that goes back to 1900. So as you can see, these are pressures. And when they started to get to 1989, so things were relatively static at that period in time in this part of the world, when we started capping and piping schemes. And so if you look at that, you can see a general trend in the upward direction from all those bores. So that's a positive. So that's telling us that when you stop the free flow of these bores, you can start to regain the aquifer will regain pressure, and that's what we're looking for. So we also look at protection of springs in the water plan. So just to give you an idea, those 310 complexes I talked about before, the green dots are what we call GAB spring vent sites. So these are individual discharge sites. There's blue lines that you'll see in various parts here, around there. They're what we call watercourses, where there's potential for the Great Artesian Basin to contribute to the stream. So these are generally in what we would call outcrop areas or recharge areas, where the stream is incised down into the water table. The orange area down here is the Yalabin Desert ecosystem, which I'm not sure many people have seen. It's not that pretty. It's not like other GAB springs, but there is a endemic spinifex there. And the reason for that is that the GAB water comes to the surface. The salts in the water create a soil drought, and therefore you get a desert plant growing in a subtropical area because of the effect that the GAB water has had on the soil over a long period of time. So all water licence decisions that we make under the Gabora plan considers the impact of these springs, these features. We do springs monitoring around the place, and there's just some various photos of GAB springs and the different types of springs that you find in the GAB. As I say, some of them don't look that flash, but they are spring sites. These are probably more of what we would class your desert type springs or your discharge type springs, where the water's coming from a long way down and popping up through a fracture or a crack in the sandstone or the ground. This is more of what we would call a spring. That's where there's water coming out, not under a significant amount of pressure, but it's been capped, or there's been some incision through the GOB aquifer, which has allowed water to come to the surface. So as I talked about before, we're seeing all these pressures rising. And in some parts of the state, we're starting to see springs re-emerging. So Desert Channels Queensland is a project where they're starting to find and map using drones, which is pretty innovative. And they also they use infrared to pick out green areas. So they're able to find basically a weed, which is nice and green in the middle of a pretty brown area, to see where we're getting emerging springs coming back. So what's the monitoring telling us? And around all these springs here, we've just put a 50-kilometre buffer around them. And where we have monitoring, what we're finding is that we've got stable or increasing pressure near these spring sites. And in most cases, we've got groundwater heads above the elevation of the GDE. So you have to have a groundwater head or a water surface higher than the ground surface. Otherwise, you don't get a spring. So there's been various programs which I've talked about to rehabilitate, what they call the rehabilitation programs. And as I talked about before, in 1989, these commenced. Things like what we call the Bore Drain Replacement Scheme, or GABSI, some people may have heard of. So they were to rehabilitate uncontrolled artesian bores in the Queensland section of the GOB, install piping systems to replace bore drains. Up to 90% of the cost is provided to landholders for these projects. So there's federal and state government monies put together. The two most recent programs have been called the Improving Great Artesian Basin Drought Resilience Project, which is finishing next year, and the Great Artesian Basin Industry Partnership Program, which finished in 2023. These are the parts of Queensland that we're talking about. So these green dots, it was the one program, and the other program was the yellow dots. But as you can see, there's a number of bores and piping systems that they've targeted in these areas. So what does this mean in terms of numbers? So overall, from 1989 to 2023, there's been 769 bores that have been rehabilitated and or plugged. There's been 15,264 kilometres of bore drains decommissioned and around 20,000 kilometres of piping installed. So the state, federal and industry investment in all of that. So there are cases where industry has put money in to save water as well, at $177.6 million and around $65 million of landholder investment. And what does that mean? We're looking at around about 226,000 megalitres of annual water savings. So it's a pretty successful program. What does this look like when you look at bore drains on the ground now? So this is a map going back to the 60s, and hopefully you can see that, but the little squiggly lines all over the place, they were bore drains. This day and age, more recently, there's some blue lines here that you'll see in parts of the world, and this is where most of the bore drain systems that are left. So we've gone from 34,000 down to 4. That was 2018. So more work's been done since then. And that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just looking at some of the numbers you presented then, and it seemed to me the $277 million is a good news story. When we see other budget items in the papers every day, the amount of money that's being spent here to that just seems like good value. And one of the things also that struck me was the we don't hear. We're more inclined to listen to bad news, but this is a good news story, and I'm very pleased to have heard it. So. I've got some questions for you.
Yeah, sure.
And I think there's a chat line down the bottom there for people to add to. So I'm going to look after that later. We've come to the numbers that struck my attention. You had 69 million megalitres of water in the basin.
69,000 million.
69,000 million.
Yeah.
Okay. And 200,000 megalitres annual production. Do we think that we're at a sustainable level, or when would we know that? When will we be easy to do that?
Well, we're certainly working towards sustainability. I guess my answer to that would be that we still need to know a lot more about the amount of water that goes into the GAB, because it's such a big system, and the timeframes that we talk about in terms of water getting in and water getting out are hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we have a significant volume of storage there. The assessed yield at this time is probably less than what's coming out, but we're still on our way to saving water, and we're making that a lot closer.
I noticed also on the slide there you had temperatures of up to 199.9 degrees at Birdsville.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about there used to be a geothermal power station there. Is that still there?
As far as I know, it is. Yeah, they were using geothermal to create electricity. I had heard recently that they've replaced it with solar, being a whole lot more efficient.
And also, I saw from my own field experience that there's other areas of springs on what we know geologically as the Canaway Ridge, which is the border between the Eromanga and the Surat Basin. So it didn't seem to show up in the map. So hopefully some of those will reappear as the pressures are restored.
Yeah, so there's a significant spring group down near Yulo, west of Cunnamulla, called the Yower Spring Group. So there's still a number of bores in that part of the world to be rehabbed and piping to be done, but we are seeing pressures starting to rise in those areas. Yeah, and you would hope over time we would start to get back for those spring systems being reactivated again.
And how do you, when you talk about these uncontrolled bores, what's the solution for them? Do we try to control them, or do we plug them?
Well, the only real solution is to plug them full of cement and drill another hole, in most cases. So it's an engineering solution, and that when I talked about before that there's been 769 bores either rehabilitated or plugged, that's what we're talking about. So in most cases, you need to find the old bore, and in some cases that's not that easy because being uncontrolled, it's probably sitting in a big pile of pretty hot water. So there's been some pretty innovative engineering solutions to actually find these bores and plug them. But yeah, that is the only real solution.
And when say you're looking for them, how do you do that?
When you're looking for them?
Well, if there's are there bores out there still that we don't know about? There are old bores that were.
Well, the thing about when Yeah, you tend to find them when they start to flow again. That's actually probably the best way in most cases. In some cases, we may not have any information about some of these bores. So there are bores that are starting to flow again. So while we're capping and rehabilitating bores, we're also creating another problem because some old bores are starting to flow again that haven't flowed for 90 years.
What are we doing with sorry, with the? I also noticed on the slide where you had the flows versus time, that we had large flows and large uncertainties in the past. We would have had a lot lesser number of bores in those days. Is that where the uncertainty comes from?
No, the uncertainty comes from we're making estimates based on, I guess, the bore gauging work, which is we were doing assessments at the time of what the flows actually were. But the flow is always changing. So based on the amount of bores that we thought we knew about and what they were flowing at a time period, a bore that flowed at 1 million gallons a day in 1920 may have only been flowing at 500,000 gallons a day in 1930. So there's just some uncertainty there in where we make our estimates, that's all.
The other thing that you mentioned in the slide, some of the uses of the water, there was a lot of town water. Is the water, does it have to be treated before it's suitable for town water?
In most cases, it doesn't. The water quality is good enough that you can use it straight away. In some cases, there may be some. If you go to Wandoan, they have an iron removal plant because there's a lot of inherent iron in the precipice water there. So they have to do some sort of treatment, and in a lot of cases now also they have to add fluoride. So some people probably may not see the GAB water as being that palatable in some places. It tends to be a lot softer water. It's got a lot more bicarbonates in it. I think it's pretty good myself, but a lot of people don't like it.
Does it get used for cropping?
For cropping? In some cases, yes, particularly more around the margins of the basin, where the water quality tends not to be as sodic, and there are areas where definitely there is irrigation being undertaken through GAB. So there was a long policy from the early 50s that the hierarchy of use was for domestic stock and then irrigation. So it was only ever allowed in limited cases. But these days, yeah, it tends to be a very high value water in the market. So it tends to get used for where high reliability is required.
I also know from my petroleum experience that we have the aquifers that you were talking about, we sometimes see these thin as 3 to 4 meters, and they're fitting directly in the hut and they're able to retain hydrocarbons behind them. Yep. So it's just about the quality of the aquifer, not necessarily the efficiency, and that's always surprising. That we can have water travelling along between the aquifers and not moving between the formations, but until we get to a fold or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about very slow movements. I guess the other thing I didn't talk about was that when the oil and gas industry in Queensland was born out of artesian drilling. They found gas at Broma back in the early 1900s when they were drilling a town bore. They actually had it hooked up for electricity and lights, and it lasted about 10 days, the gas supply. So, but it wasn't that successful, but those aquifers, like the precipice and the Hutton that I was talking about, do tend to become hydrocarbon traps for oil and gas as well.
John, are you listening? Are you able to? Do you want me to open the chat for questions, or?
Yep, I think we can open up the chat for questions now. There looks to be a few in there. I think our first one that came in was from Ray Andrews. Can you address, Adrian, the Carpentaria Offshore Basin and the Papuan Moore Head Basin?
I can't really, other than the Carpentaria Basin does go out under the Gulf of Carpentaria, and it is part of the GAB.
The Moorhead Basin is separated. It's got rocks.
Yes, as far as I understand. Yeah.
Brilliant. Our next one from John Fairburn. Does gas and oil drilling compromise the GAB over time?
I wouldn't say it compromises it necessarily. It's certainly, in some cases, when you take oil and gas out, you'll bring water with it, and that's the associated water that I was talking about. There's different types of gas and oil reserves. The ones I was just talking about in terms of Roma, and when they were drilling for oil, that's what we would call normally more conventional oil and gas. So there's been an oil field at Mooney since the 1960s, and they've been taking oil and gas out there for obviously 50 odd years. It certainly takes water out of the basin when you do that, but at this stage we haven't seen that it's compromised the basin or that aquifer to an extent that we can't still use it.
Brilliant. And we've got a few more on this topic. What are the risks to GAB security should gas fracking be expanded?
Well, my understanding is that they don't frack currently in coal seam gas areas. There are other types of, hydrocarbon, shale oil gas that they would use fracking. But these are in generally upper or mainly aquatards, not in the gas formate, not in the aquifers themselves. So I don't see it as a tremendous threat to the basin at this stage with current development.
Brilliant. And last one around this theme, will Queensland government allow CSG wastewater to be pumped back into the GAB, treated or untreated? And don't know enough about the chemistry to give assurances of non-pollution?
I know that there is, I think Origin are re-injecting water back in to the basin, into the precipice. I've been out and seen, I guess, how they treat the water that goes back into the basin. To make it work, they have to do a lot of chemical matching to make sure that the water that goes back in is consistent with the receiving waters. So they do a lot of work around that. I know that's been operating for quite a period of time now, and as I understand, it's been relatively successful. I think if you're putting water back in that is of similar quality to what the endemic water is, then I can't see that there's a significant risk there.
Brilliant. And the last question we do have in the chat this evening from Neil, do any stock routes still have free-flowing bores?
That's a pretty good question. I don't I don't know of any, to tell you the truth, but then I couldn't say that I know for sure.
We did have one more pop up. Are the hydrocarbon reserves generally above the GAB? Are there any in or below the GAB levels?
So the hydrocarbon reserves, they sit in a number of formations. They are in the GAB for sure. As I talked about a little bit about when I talked about Roma and those places, the significant hydrocarbon reserves in the precipice sandstone, which is the basal aquifer, in the Hutton sandstone, the Walloon coal measures. Now, the Walloon coal measures is considered more of an aquitard, although you do get water out of it in coal seams. And then in some of the upper formations, such as the Surat siltstone, there's potential for things like shale gas, shale oils and gases. So the GAB is comprised of many different formations and layers. You tend to find that hydrocarbons exist in various amounts in all of those layers.
Brilliant. And I actually do have a question myself. Is there any reason that the Yalaban Desert is the only example of that type of ecosystem in all of the various springs and interactions of the GAB?
I think the main reason is that the Generic River incises through the outcrop of a number of the formations that I talked about there, like the Springbok sandstone and the Gubramunda sandstone. And it just happens that it's deep enough that it's incised enough into the GAB formation at that point that there's significant volumes of water coming out in that part of around the Yalaban Desert. And it's enough water to, affect a relatively large area. And it's been happening for quite a long period of time. And although you do get, in some cases, you have what we would call a cover of alluvium sitting over the top of it, the water pressure from the GAB has actually forced the bicarbonates up to the surface, and you're getting evapotranspiration at the surface over a fairly large area. And that's then led to the development of the Yalaban Desert the way it is. If you go to the other spring sites, the mechanism for the water to come to the surface is generally through a fracture, or it's a much smaller area. So it's not as though the conditions don't exist for the same things to happen. It's just that it doesn't sort of manifest in the same way. So you don't have the same area that's of evapotranspiration where you don't see the water coming to the surface. Water that comes close to the surface gets evapotranspired away. So you're not actually seeing a discharge like you do with a spring system.
Thanks so much for that, Adrian. Really fascinating. I have enjoyed driving through that area before, so good to know a bit more background. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so we might wrap up there and give both Adrian and Henk a really big thanks for their presentations for this evening. Adrian, it's been really fascinating and would definitely like to learn plenty more in this space. Just before we wrap up entirely for the evening, a quick reminder that we do have other RGSQ upcoming events, including our Geography in Conversation on the 28th of November, looking at the impact of coastal erosion on Moreton Bay ecosystems. And on the 5th of December is the RGSQ Christmas Party. So please check the website and register for those if you would like to attend. Apart from that, we will leave it there for this evening. Once again, big thanks, Adrian, Henk, and hope everyone has a fantastic evening. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Good night.